York City. In December is a city of illusions. The bright lights of Rockefeller Center and the festive windows of Fifth Avenue mask the biting, indifferent wind blowing off the East River. But in 2008, a different kind of chill was settling over Midtown Manhattan, one that no wool coat could block out. It radiated from the Lipstick Building at 885 3rd Avenue, a postmodern masterpiece of red granite and steel that looked like a temple to American prosperity. On the 19th floor, the atmosphere was elite, polished, and legitimate. But 2 floors down, on the 17th, the air was heavy with the scent of old paper and the hum of antiquated technology. This was the birthplace of a ghost, a $65 billion ghost. Bernie Madoff was the Wizard of Wall Street, the Silver Fox, whose very name was a shorthand for stability. For decades, he didn't just beat the market, he seemed to have tamed it. While other hedge funds saw their charts look like the jagged teeth of a saw blade, Bernie's returns were a work of art. It was what insiders called the smooth equity curve, a steady, unwavering line that climbed upward at a 45-degree angle, untouched by recessions, wars, or market crashes. It was financial gravity being defied in real time. To the elite country clubs of Palm Beach and the philanthropic circles of the Upper East Side, an account with Madoff wasn't just an investment, it was a certificate of belonging. It was the ultimate sleep-at-night money. But the 17th floor held the silent witnesses to the greatest deception in human history. There were no sleek terminals or high-frequency trading algorithms here. Instead, there were outdated IBM/400 computers and dot matrix printers that churned out millions of pages of fiction. Every trade confirmation, every monthly statement, every line of growth was a lie carefully curated by a skeleton crew of loyalists. They weren't trading stocks, they were digital calligraphers, painting a masterpiece of fraud one fake transaction at a time. The forensic reality was staggering. For years, not a single trade had actually been executed for the investment advisory business. The billions were nothing more than ink and ego. Deep within the man himself sat a psychological ticking clock. Born in 1938 in Queens, Bernie Madoff was a product of the middle-class hustle. He started his firm in 1960 with $5,000 earned from lifeguarding and installing sprinkler systems. But he carried a hidden scar, the memory of his father's business failures and the crushing weight of public bankruptcy. For Bernie, financial inadequacy wasn't just a risk, it was a terminal disease. He developed a narcissistic need to be the smartest man in the room, the one who possessed a secret formula the rest of the world was too slow to grasp. He didn't just want wealth, he wanted to be the pillar that the entire community leaned on. As the 2008 financial crisis began to bleed the world dry, the facade started to crack. The phone on the 17th floor wouldn't stop ringing. Investors, panicked by the global collapse, were asking for their money back. $7 billion in redemption requests were flooding in, but the coffers were nearly empty. The smooth equity curve was about to hit a brick wall. On the night of December 10th, 2008, the wizard finally ran out of spells. Standing in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of a life built on air, Bernie Madoff looked at his sons, Mark and Andrew. His face, usually a mask of calm authority, had finally surrendered to the gravity of his sins. He didn't offer a complex financial explanation or a plan for recovery. He simply spoke the words that would incinerate the lives of thousands. "It's all just one big lie," he whispered. "It's finished. There is absolutely nothing left." But as his sons walked out of the apartment, Bernie didn't realize that the nightmare was only beginning. He thought he was confessing to a failure, but he was actually signing a death warrant for his legacy, and he had no idea who was already waiting at the door. Bernie stood in the center of his Upper East Side penthouse, the silence following his son's departure feeling like a physical weight. The air, usually thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy stillness of old money, now felt cold and sterile. He had spent decades weaving a tapestry of gold, only to realize he was clutching a handful of ash. To understand how a man could look into the eyes of his own children and admit to vaporizing $65 billion, we have to go back to the humid summer of 1960 in Queens, New York. A young Bernie, just 22 years old, wasn't just looking for a career. He was hunting for an escape from the ghost of his father's humiliation. Ralph Madoff's business had collapsed under the suffocating weight of tax liens and debt, a public shaming that left a scar on Bernie more permanent than any brand. In the Madoff household, financial inadequacy wasn't just a hurdle, it was a moral failing. Bernie watched his father shrink into insignificance, and in that moment, the blueprint for his life was drafted. He would never be small. He would be the sun around which the financial world orbited. He started with $5,000, earned under the scorching New York sun as a lifeguard, and installing sprinkler systems. It was honest money, the kind of bootstrap beginning that makes for a great American legend. But Bernie had no interest in the slow burn of honesty. He had a preternatural obsession with the mechanics of the market. He wasn't just a trader, he was a pioneer. He helped build NASDAQ, dragging the dusty, paper-cluttered world of the stock exchange into the digital age. By the early 1990s, Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities was a titan, a market-making machine that handled nearly 10% of all trades on the New York Stock Exchange. That was the legitimate front, the polished, gleaming marble lobby of his legacy. But behind the glass and steel, on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building in Midtown Manhattan, a different kind of alchemy was taking place. This was the laboratory of the architect. Bernie didn't offer the volatile, adrenaline-soaked returns of a high-stakes gambler. He offered something far more addictive to the wealthy, the illusion of safety. He called it the split-strike conversion strategy. It was a sophisticated-sounding dance of buying blue-chip stocks and hedging them with options to limit downside risk. On paper, it was a stroke of genius. In reality, it was a phantom. Bernie was the master of the smooth equity curve, while the rest of the world's portfolios looked like a jagged mountain range of peaks and valleys. Madoff's returns were a gentle, unwavering upward slope. Rain or shine, bull or bear, Bernie's clients saw a steady 10 to 12% return. It was the financial equivalent of a heartbeat that never skipped, a physical impossibility in a market defined by chaos. He targeted affinity groups, utilizing high society social circles, elite country clubs from Palm Beach to the Hamptons, and Jewish philanthropic organizations to build a fortress of trust. He didn't sell a product. He sold an invitation to an exclusive club where the entrance fee was total, unquestioning faith. His narcissism was his strongest armor. He was the benevolent patriarch, the man who knew something the rest of the world didn't. He didn't chase investors. He made them beg to give him their money. If an investor asked too many questions, he would threaten to return their capital and kick them out of the fund. It was a psychological masterstroke. By creating a facade of exclusivity, he silenced the very skepticism that should have been his undoing. Yet, the silent witnesses were there, hidden in plain sight. The trade confirmations sent to clients were printed on outdated dot matrix printers, looking like relics from a bygone era in an industry that moved at the speed of light. There were no electronic records of the billions of trades he claimed to be making. On that 17th floor, a skeleton crew of high school-educated clerks was manually typing up a fantasy, creating a paper trail that led to a black hole. As the sun set on that December day in 2008, Bernie knew the walls were finally closing in. The global economy was hemorrhaging, and his smooth curve had finally hit a jagged terminal edge. $7 billion in withdrawal requests were sitting on his desk like unexploded grenades. He was a man out of time, a magician whose last trick had been exposed. But while his sons were reeling from his confession, a team of federal agents was already gathering blocks away. They weren't just coming for a failed businessman. They were coming for a man who had turned the American dream into a house of mirrors. And they were about to discover that the most loyal members of Bernie's inner circle had been keeping secrets that would make his confession look like a bedtime story. To understand the magnitude of Madoff's deception, you have to understand the geography of the Lipstick Building at 885 3rd Avenue. It is an architectural marvel, a rounded salmon-colored tower that stands as a monument to Manhattan's corporate ego. On the 19th floor, everything was pristine. This was Madoff's legitimate market-making business, a high-tech, white-walled hive of activity where his sons, Mark and Andrew, oversaw billions in real trades. It was a glass and steel showcase of transparency. But 2 floors down, on the 17th floor, the atmosphere shifted. This was the back office. If the 19th floor was the glistening skin of the operation, the 17th floor was its rotting heart. It was a windowless labyrinth of wood paneling and outdated technology. Here, the hum of high-speed servers was replaced by the rhythmic clatter of ancient dot matrix printers and the scratching of pens on ledger paper. It felt less like a modern brokerage and more like a 1970s counting house. This was the domain of Frank DePascali, Bernie's right-hand man, a street-smart guy from Queens who spoke in the gravelly tones of a longshoreman, but possessed the chilling precision of a master forger. DePascali and a small, hand-picked crew of loyalists weren't trading stocks. They were trading in fiction. Their primary tool was a silent witness that would later tell the whole story, an IBM AS/400 computer. This machine was a dinosaur by 2008 standards, but for Bernie, its obsolescence was its greatest asset. It wasn't connected to the internet. It was an island where reality could be rewritten by hand. Every month, this team performed a dark kind of digital alchemy. They didn't react to the market. They looked at the market in the rearview mirror. They would wait until the end of the month, see which stocks had performed well, and then use the AS/400 to backdate trades that looked impossibly prescient. It was a digital choose-your-own-adventure where the ending was always a profit. They were printing thousands of pages of account statements, each one a masterpiece of forensic fraud, showing a smooth equity curve, that steady 45-degree line of growth that never dipped, never wavered, and never, ever lost money. To the outside world, Madoff was a wizard. To those inside the 17th floor, he was a god who demanded total, unquestioning silence. He cultivated a culture of exclusivity. If you were a client, you felt like you'd been invited into an elite club, a sanctum sanctorum of generational wealth. He would often play hard to get, telling potential investors he was closed to new money, only to relent as a personal favor. This psychological grooming made people too grateful to ask questions. They weren't just investing their money, they were investing their identity. But the paper trail was starting to bleed. While Bernie sat in his corner office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline with the detached calm of a shark, the friction of the real world was beginning to heat up. The global economy was shivering, and for the first time in decades, the black box of the 17th floor couldn't produce enough fake returns to cover the very real demands for cash. The labyrinth was running out of exits, and as the sun began to set over the city on that cold December evening, Bernie realized that the most dangerous witness wasn't a person at all. It was a simple, 3-word phrase etched into a secret ledger that would prove his entire legacy was nothing more than a ghost story. One that was about to haunt the very people he claimed to love the most. The black box of the 17th floor couldn't produce enough fake returns to cover the very real demands for cash. The labyrinth was running out of exits, And as the sun began to set over the city on that cold December evening, Bernie realized that the most dangerous witness wasn't a person at all. It was a simple, three-word phrase etched into a secret ledger that would prove his entire legacy was nothing more than a ghost story. One that was about to haunt the very people he claimed to love the most. The phrase was, the big table. In the sterile, high-tech world of Wall Street, where algorithms and fiber optic cables dictate the flow of billions, the big table was an anachronism. It was a manual record, a physical manifestation of a digital lie. To the outside world, Bernie Madoff was a pioneer of electronic trading, a man who helped build NASDAQ and brought the stock market into the future. But on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building, the future was being forged with the tools of the past. Old IBM AS/400 computers and dot matrix printers that churned out thousands of pages of fiction every single month. This was the illusion of mathematics. Bernie's secret weapon wasn't a complex algorithm. It was the split-strike conversion strategy. To an untrained ear, it sounded like financial wizardry, a sophisticated dance of buying blue-chip stocks and hedging them with options to ensure steady, modest gains, regardless of market volatility. It was the smooth equity curve, a line that pointed perpetually upward at a 45-degree angle, never faltering, never dipping. It was the financial equivalent of a heartbeat that never skipped, even during a marathon. But mathematics is a jealous mistress. It demands balance. In the real world, the market breathes. It expands and contracts, bleeding red one day and basking in green the next. Bernie's numbers didn't breathe. They were frozen in a state of impossible perfection. To maintain this, he relied on a hand-picked crew of loyalists, not Ivy League MBAs, but clerks and high school graduates who didn't ask questions as long as the bonuses kept coming. They were the ghosts in the machine, typing out trade confirmations for stocks that were never bought and options that were never sold. The psychological toll of this deception was immense, yet Bernie wore it like a tailored suit. He possessed a terrifying level of emotional detachment, a hallmark of the narcissistic personality that drove him. He wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing the concept of safety. He targeted the big fish, charitable foundations, university endowments, and the pillars of the Jewish community, knowing that his shared heritage and philanthropic veneer created a shield of trust that no regulator would dare to pierce. He was the ultimate insider, the man who knew the secrets of the market, the one who could protect your wealth when the world went mad. But by late 2008, the world hadn't just gone mad. It had broken. The subprime mortgage crisis was a tidal wave, and the water was receding, revealing who had been swimming naked. As the markets tanked, Bernie's split-strike strategy should have been his shield. Instead, it became his noose. Investors, panicked and bleeding, began to call for their cash. $7 billion in redemption requests flooded the 17th floor in a matter of weeks. Bernie sat in his office, the glow of the New York skyline mocking him. He looked at the ledger, at the big table that showed the horrifying gap between what he told the world he had and what was actually in the bank. The math was finally pushing back. He had spent 40 years building a fortress of numbers, and now the walls were screaming. He knew the end wasn't just near, it was in the room with him. And as he reached for the phone to call his sons for a private meeting, he realized that the most devastating part of the collapse wasn't the billions lost. It was the fact that the people who trusted him most were the ones who would have to pull the trigger on his execution. The silence in that office was heavy, the kind of stillness that usually precedes a gunshot. Bernie sat behind his desk, the mahogany surface polished to a mirror finish, reflecting a man who had spent half a century perfecting a role. To the world, he was the Titan of Wall Street, the visionary who turned the stock market into a digital symphony. But inside that custom-tailored suit was a child from Queens who had watched his father, Ralph, wither away under the crushing shame of business failure. That trauma hadn't just motivated Bernie, it had mutated him. He didn't just fear failure, he viewed it as a death sentence, a social leprosy he would do anything, absolutely anything to avoid. His psychological makeup was a labyrinth of high-functioning narcissism and chilling emotional detachment. For decades, he had maintained a smooth equity curve, a statistical miracle that promised consistent gains regardless of whether the market was soaring or screaming toward the pavement. It was a siren song for the elite. He targeted his own, the Jewish country clubs of Palm Beach, the high society philanthropies of Manhattan, the people who shared his table and his faith. He played on the most human of vulnerabilities, the desire to belong. To be in with Bernie was to be safe. But the safety was a phantom, a house of cards built over a canyon of absolute emptiness. By December 2008, the canyon was calling for its due. The global financial crisis was no longer a distant thunder. It was a hurricane tearing through his balance sheets. Investors, panicked by the collapse of Lehman Brothers, were clawing at his doors, demanding $7 billion in redemptions. Bernie, the man with the golden touch, was holding an empty bag. He had spent years as a market maker, a pioneer who helped build the NASDAQ. But his true masterpiece was the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. That was the engine room of the fraud, where a handful of loyalists used outdated IBM AS/400 computers to generate thousands of pages of fiction. There were no trades. There was no split-strike conversion. There was only the money of the new being used to quiet the demands of the old. The mask was finally slipping, revealing the hollow core of a predator who felt no genuine remorse for the widows, the charities, or the lifelong friends he was about to incinerate. He wasn't a gardener of wealth. He was a parasite that had grown too large for its host. On the morning of December 10th, Bernie knew he couldn't stall another day. He needed to tell someone, but the narcissist in him couldn't bear to confess to a stranger or a regulator. He needed to bring the disaster home. He summoned Mark and Andrew to his penthouse on the Upper East Side. They arrived expecting a discussion about year-end bonuses, perhaps a strategy for the coming year. Instead, they found a father who looked diminished, a man whose aura of invincibility had vanished like a ghost in the morning light. He paced the floor of the apartment, the luxury of the space feeling more like a gilded cage with every passing second. When he finally spoke, the words didn't come out with his usual practiced calm. They were jagged. He looked at the two men he had raised to follow in his footsteps, the sons who had built their entire lives on the bedrock of his reputation. He took a breath, the weight of $65 billion of lies pressing against his lungs, and told them that the entire firm, their lives, their legacy, their father, was nothing more than one big lie. But as the confession hung in the air, Bernie didn't yet realize that by telling his sons the truth, he had forced them into a choice that would destroy the family forever. And the boys were already reaching for their coats. Ons who had built their entire lives on the bedrock of his reputation. He took a breath, the weight of $65 billion of lies pressing against his lungs, and told them that the entire firm, their lives, their legacy, their father, was nothing more than one big lie. But as the confession hung in the air, Bernie didn't yet realize that by telling his sons the truth, he had forced them into a choice that would destroy the family forever. And the boys were already reaching for their coats. While the Madoff family unit was fracturing in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, we have to travel back in time to understand how this shadow empire survived for decades, despite a trail of mathematical breadcrumbs that should have led straight to a federal prison. This wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was a decades-long game of cat and mouse, where the cat was wearing a blindfold and the mouse owned the house. Enter Harry Markopoulos. If Bernie Madoff was the polished face of Wall Street, Markopoulos was its frantic, data-driven conscience. A math-obsessed quant with a background in the Army Reserve, Markopoulos didn't care about Bernie's charm or his philanthropic galas. He only cared about the numbers. And in 1999, when his employer at Rampart Investment Management asked him to reverse engineer Madoff's strategy to replicate his success, Markopoulos hit a brick wall. He sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of Madoff's trading records, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The math didn't just fail to add up, it defied the laws of physics. Madoff claimed to use a split-strike conversion strategy, buying blue-chip stocks and hedging them with options. But when Markopoulos looked at the volume of the trades Bernie claimed to be making, he realized there weren't enough options in existence on the entire Chicago Board Options Exchange to cover Madoff's purported positions. It was a ghost ship sailing through a sea of imaginary paper. By May 2000, Markopoulos sent his first 8-page submission to the SEC's Boston office. He titled it with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, "The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud." He waited for the sirens. He waited for the raids. Instead, he got silence. This was the beginning of an agonizing chess match. Markopoulos was playing for the truth. The SEC was playing for the status quo. For 9 years, Markopoulos became a whistleblower in the wilderness. He sent more reports in 2001, 2005, 2007, and 2008. His 2005 memo was a 29-page masterpiece of forensic accounting, listing 29 specific red flags. He pointed out the smooth equity curve, a line of returns that went up at a constant 45-degree angle with almost no downward ticks, regardless of whether the market was booming or crashing. In the world of finance, that kind of consistency isn't talent. It's a statistical impossibility. It's a heartbeat that never skips, even during a mountain marathon. But Bernie was a master of the institutional bluff. When the SEC finally did send investigators to look at his books. In 2006, Bernie didn't sweat. He sat them down in his plush office, offered them coffee, and handed over a list of account numbers. He told them he was a market maker, a pioneer of the NASDAQ, a man who had helped build the very infrastructure they regulated. He blinded them with his pedigree. The investigators, young and inexperienced, didn't even bother to pick up the phone and call the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation to verify if the money was actually there. If they had, the $65 billion house of cards would have collapsed in 5 minutes with a single phone call. Instead, they closed the file. They gave Bernie a pass, citing minor technical violations. Markopoulos, meanwhile, was spiraling into a state of hypervigilance. He began to fear for his life, checking under his car for bombs and carrying a firearm. He knew he was hunting a monster, but he didn't realize that the monster was being protected by the very people paid to slay it. As the 2008 financial crisis began to brew, the chess match entered its endgame. The market was shivering, and the smooth equity curve was about to meet a reality it couldn't fake. But the most terrifying realization wasn't that Bernie had fooled the world. It was that the world's most powerful regulators had seen the evidence, held the truth in their hands, and simply looked away. And now, as the global economy began to bleed, the man who had been the architect of everyone's security was about to become the instrument of their total destruction. The match entered its endgame. The market was shivering, and the smooth equity curve was about to meet a reality it couldn't fake. But the most terrifying realization wasn't that Bernie had fooled the world. It was that the world's most powerful regulators had seen the evidence, held the truth in their hands, and simply looked away. And now, as the global economy began to bleed, the man who had been the architect of everyone's security was about to become the instrument of their total destruction. To understand how Bernie Madoff orchestrated a $65 billion ghost story, you have to understand the poisoned table. In the world of white-collar crime, we call it affinity fraud. It is the most intimate form of predatory behavior, a predator who wears the same shawl, speaks the same dialect, and prays in the same pews as his prey. Bernie didn't just hunt, he curated. He didn't need to knock on doors because he had already been invited into the inner sanctum of the world's most exclusive circles. From the manicured greens of the Palm Beach Country Club to the high society galas of Manhattan, Bernie was the gold standard. He was the Jewish T-bill, a financial patriarch who offered something better than wealth. He offered belonging. His velvet rope strategy was a psychological masterstroke. If you asked to invest, he might turn you down. He'd tell you the fund was closed, making the smooth equity curve look like a rare vintage available only to the elite. This artificial scarcity created a fever. People begged him to take their life savings, their children's trust funds, and the endowments of charities that fed the hungry and healed the sick. The silent witnesses to this betrayal weren't found in a dusty warehouse, but on the walls of hospitals and the letterheads of nonprofits. Thousands of donor plaques in Jerusalem and New York bore the names of people whose entire philanthropic legacies were being siphoned into a black hole on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. Bernie sat at those tables, breaking bread with men like Elie Wiesel, looking into the eyes of Holocaust survivors, while knowing that their secure future was nothing more than a series of fabricated trade confirmations printed on an old IBM AS/400. Behind the charismatic smile was the cold, calculating mind of a man terrified of his own history. The trauma of his father's business failures in Queens had mutated into a pathological need for status. He wasn't just chasing money, he was outrunning the ghost of bankruptcy. This internal monologue, a relentless drive to never be the loser, meant that every withdrawal request was a personal attack, and every market dip was a threat to his very existence. He had detached himself from empathy so completely that he viewed his friends not as people, but as liquidity providers. By early 2008, the forensic reality was catching up. The split-strike conversion strategy he claimed to use, a complex dance of buying blue-chip stocks and hedging with options, was a mathematical impossibility at the scale he claimed. If he were actually making the trades he reported, he would have been the entire market. But while the world was distracted by the subprime mortgage meltdown, Bernie's internal ledger was screaming. The smooth equity curve was about to hit a wall of fire. As the leaves turned brown in Central Park that October, the phone calls started changing. They weren't from people wanting in, they were from people needing out. The global financial system was seizing up, and the world's elite were suddenly desperate for cash. Bernie Madoff, the man who had spent 40 years building a fortress of trust, looked at his computer screen and saw the number that would end him. $7 billion. That was the amount his clients wanted back, and in the bank account that was supposed to hold their futures, there was almost nothing. The architect of the world's greatest illusion was staring at the end of the line, but he had one final devastating card left to play, a card that would shatter his own family forever. December 2008 was the coldest winter Wall Street had ever seen. While the rest of the world watched the Dow Jones plummet like a stone through glass, Bernie Madoff sat in the eye of a different storm. The collapse of Lehman Brothers in September had been the first domino, a seismic shift that turned a manageable anxiety into a wholesale global contagion. By early December, the phone lines at Madoff Investment Securities weren't just ringing, they were screaming. Everyone wanted out. Everyone wanted their cash. The silent witness to this slow-motion car crash was an outdated IBM AS/400 computer sitting on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. This machine, a relic of a previous era, was the heart of the deception. It didn't execute trades, it printed ghosts. It churned out the thousands of pages of fake account statements that had convinced the world's elite they were getting rich while the market burned. But even the most sophisticated ghost-making machine couldn't print $7 billion in cold, hard liquidity. Bernie was 69 years old, and the ghost of his father's business failure, the shame of bankruptcy he had spent a lifetime running from, was finally catching up to him. His psychological armor, built on 40 years of narcissistic invincibility, began to crack. He wasn't just losing money, he was losing the smooth equity curve, the visual representation of his genius. To a man like Madoff, that curve was his identity. Without it, he was just a scared kid from Queens who had stayed at the party way too long. On December 10th, 2008, the mask didn't just slip, it dissolved. In his office, surrounded by the high-end art and the sleek, minimalist decor that projected stability, Bernie met with his sons, Mark and Andrew. These were the men he had raised to believe in the Madoff name, as if it were a religion. He told them he wanted to pay out over $170 million in bonuses to employees and insiders, months ahead of schedule. It was a move born of pure, desperate panic. He was trying to take care of his inner circle before the lights went out. When his sons asked where the money was coming from, given the massive redemption requests flooding the firm, Bernie's composure finally snapped. He couldn't maintain the lie in front of his own flesh and blood any longer. He invited them to his penthouse on the Upper East Side later that evening, telling them he was at the end of his rope. When they arrived at the apartment, the atmosphere was funereal. Bernie, the man who always had an answer for every regulator and every skeptical analyst, looked frail. He sat down and, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he uttered the words that would incinerate his legacy. He told his sons that the entire investment advisory business was a giant Ponzi scheme. He estimated the losses at $50 billion. He told them there was absolutely nothing left. Mark and Andrew sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation crushing the air from the room. They weren't just hearing about a financial loss. They were witnessing the total erasure of their lives, their careers, and their father's soul. Bernie spoke of the fraud as if it were a burden he was tired of carrying, showing a chilling lack of empathy for the thousands of lives he had just destroyed. He was already planning his final exit, hoping for a few more days to distribute the remaining cash to family and friends before the feds broke down the door. But the sons he had raised with a strict sense of proprietary honor couldn't be part of the cover-up. As they walked out of the penthouse and into the biting New York night, they knew they had only one choice. They called their lawyers, and their lawyers called the authorities. The clock began to tick on the final hours of the greatest deception in human history. Bernie Madoff went to sleep that night knowing the wolves were at the door, but he didn't realize that the very first person to let them in would be his own son, wielding a truth that was more powerful than 40 years of lies. At 8:30 a.m. on December 11th, 2008, the doorbell of the Madoff penthouse didn't ring with the casual chime of a social visitor. It was the sharp, metallic rap of federal authority. FBI agent Theodore Katsiapi stood in the hallway, the sterile light of the corridor glinting off his badge. When he asked if there was an innocent explanation for the billions missing, Bernie didn't reach for a clever lie or a technicality. He looked at the floor, his shoulders finally slumping under the weight of a 40-year-old ghost, and whispered the words that would ignite a global firestorm. There is no innocent explanation. The aftermath was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing hemorrhage of lives. Within hours, the name Madoff mutated from a gold standard of prestige into a toxic brand of betrayal. This wasn't just a financial crime. It was an act of profound social cannibalism. Bernie had practiced affinity fraud, a predatory technique where a monster hunts within his own tribe. He had groomed the Jewish community, the elite country clubs, and world-renowned charities, using their shared history and mutual trust as the bait for his trap. The silent witnesses to this carnage weren't just the empty ledgers at the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. They were the thousands of blue and white account statements sitting on mahogany desks across the world. For decades, those papers were symbols of security, the promise of a dignified retirement, a child's tuition, or a hospital wing. Overnight, they became worthless scraps of fiction, death warrants for the dreams of the middle class and the missions of global philanthropies. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity lost nearly everything. A Nobel Peace Prize winner who had survived the Holocaust found his life's work decimated by a man who had sat at his dinner table. The psychological toll manifested in the most visceral ways. In a somber office in New York, Thierry de la Villouche, a French aristocrat and fund manager who had lost over $2 billion of his clients' money to Madoff, could no longer bear the reflection in the mirror. On a cold December morning, he was found in his office, his wrists opened with a box cutter, a bottle of sleeping pills nearby. He was the first of many who decided that a world without their honor was not a world worth inhabiting. But the darkest shadow fell upon Bernie's own blood. His sons, Mark and Andrew, were trapped in a cruel paradox. They were the ones who had turned him in, yet the public viewed them with a venomous skepticism that no investigation could cleanse. They were pariahs, their names synonymous with the greatest theft in history. Mark Madoff, in particular, became a man haunted by the silent witness of his own surname. He couldn't walk down a Manhattan street without feeling the heat of 1,000 accusatory stares. He obsessively tracked the media coverage, his internal monologue, a spiraling descent into a darkness even his father's lawyers couldn't litigate. On December 11th, 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest, the pressure reached its breaking point. While his 2-year-old son slept in the next room, Mark Madoff used a dog leash to end his life in his Soho apartment. It was a final, tragic exclamation point on the human cost of Bernie's ego. As the smoke cleared, the survivors realized the nightmare was far from over. A court-appointed trustee began the brutal process of clawbacks, suing victims who had withdrawn money years prior to pay back those who had lost everything. It turned victim against victim, a fratricidal war over the remaining shards of a broken empire. While Bernie sat in his jail cell, his world was being dismantled brick by brick, but a chilling realization began to circulate among the forensic investigators. As they dug through the ruins of the 17th floor, they found evidence that the rot didn't just stop at Bernie. It suggested that the greatest secret was yet to be told. Had withdrawn money years prior to pay back those who had lost everything. It turned victim against victim, a fratricidal war over the remaining shards of a broken empire. While Bernie sat in his jail cell, his world was being dismantled brick by brick, but a chilling realization began to circulate among the forensic investigators. As they dug through the ruins of the 17th floor, they found evidence that the rot didn't just stop at Bernie. It suggested that the greatest secret was yet to be told. The investigators didn't just find ledgers, they found a graveyard of trust. They stared at the IBM AS/400, a hulking piece of outdated hardware tucked away in the 17th floor's gray room. This machine was the ghost in the machine, the engine that fabricated billions of dollars in phantom wealth. While the world outside transitioned to high-frequency trading and sleek digital interfaces, Bernie's fraud was built on the steady, rhythmic clicking of dot matrix printers. Those printers were the silent witnesses to a crime so vast it defied the imagination of the SEOBASIC. Day after day, year after year, they churned out millions of pages of lies, each one a paper arrow aimed at the heart of an investor's future. To look at that dusty hardware was to look at the cold, mechanical heart of a sociopath. Irving Picard and his team of forensic bloodhounds began to realize that the $65 billion hole wasn't just Bernie's doing. The paper trail whispered of feeder funds that looked the other way, of international banks that smelled the sulfur but kept the vault doors open because the fees were too sweet to ignore. The rot was systemic. It wasn't just a monster in the basement, it was the architecture of the house itself. The forensic terminology painted a grim picture. Net equity, clawbacks, and commingled accounts became the vocabulary of a decade-long autopsy. And then there was the human cost, the collateral damage that Bernie's narcissism couldn't, or wouldn't, calculate. On December 11th, 2010, exactly 2 years to the day after his father's arrest, Mark Madoff was found in his Manhattan apartment. He had used a dog leash to end his life, while his 2-year-old son slept in the next room. Mark couldn't escape the shadow of the Madoff name, a moniker that had become a global shorthand for traitor. 4 years later, Andrew Madoff succumbed to mantle cell lymphoma, a disease he claimed was fueled by the sheer, crushing stress of his father's betrayal. Bernie had survived his own children, a dark inversion of the natural order that left him alone with his secrets. Bernie spent his final years in the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. Inmate number 6, 1727-054. He was a king without a kingdom, holding court in the prison yard, explaining to other inmates how the world really worked. He expressed no tears for the elderly, who were forced back into the workforce at 80, no sorrow for the charities that vanished overnight. To Bernie, they were just numbers on a screen that hadn't balanced. He was the ultimate predator, a man who had replaced his pulse with a ticker tape. He died as he lived, steeped in a profound, chilling detachment. On April 14th, 2021, at 3:29 a.m., the ghost finally left the machine. Bernie Madoff died of natural causes, alone in a prison bed. But as the sun rose over Wall Street that morning, a chilling realization remained. The money was mostly gone, and the little red book of names he kept hidden still held secrets that may never be fully aired. The final revelation wasn't about the money he stole, but the vacuum he left behind. Even now, in the quiet corners of the financial district, there's a whisper that Bernie wasn't an anomaly. He was a mirror. He showed us that the most dangerous lie is the one we want to believe. The promise of a world where the line only goes up and the music never stops. As the files are moved to archives and the 17th floor is rented out to new tenants, one question lingers like a cold draft in an empty room. In a world built on the illusion of stability, who is the next Bernie Madoff sitting in plain sight, waiting for the lights to go out?